On the night of August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant Ray Gemmell climbed into the nose compartment of a B-17 flying fortress named Lucky Penny and did not know he was about to become a target. The air over Schweinfurt smelled of cordite and burning hydraulic fluid. At 23,000 feet, the temperature inside the unpressurized bomber had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Gemmell's oxygen mask had begun to ice at the edges. His gloves were so thick he could barely feel the toggle switches beneath his fingers. Around him, 230 American bombers pressed eastward into Germany in tight combat box formations, wing to wing, nose to tail, the largest daylight precision bombing mission the 8th Air Force had ever attempted. Below them, the darkness of occupied Europe stretched unbroken in every direction. Then the darkness answered back. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. A single Messerschmitt Bf 110 climbed toward the formation from below, unhurried, almost leisurely. Its pilot, Hauptmann August Geiger of Jagdgeschwader 1, did not use his guns. He did not need to. He simply looked upward and studied what he saw. The American bombers, which Allied planners had assumed would be invisible against the black sky above 30,000 feet, were glowing. Every exhaust stack on every right Cyclone engine was producing a pale blue-white flame visible from 2 miles away. The formation of 230 aircraft was not a shadow fleet slipping through German airspace. It was a procession of moving lights, each one marking a crew of 10 men. Geiger reported his observation to ground control at 21:47. The intercepts began 7 minutes later. What Gemmell and the other crews of the 8th Air Force did not know, could not have known, was that the device responsible for their visibility had been installed specifically to protect them. 3 weeks earlier, American ground crews at Molesworth and Bassingbourn had fitted the bombers with new exhaust flame dampeners, developed after urgent requests from crews who had watched their own aircraft light up the night sky during earlier raids. The dampeners were an engineering response to a genuine and documented danger. They had been tested, approved, and rushed into field installation with the full confidence of the Army Air Force's technical staff. They had also, through a chain of miscalculations that nobody had yet identified, made every aircraft they touched dramatically more visible at night than the unmodified engines they replaced. 41 B-17s did not return from Schweinfurt that night. 377 American airmen were killed, captured, or listed missing. The losses were catastrophic enough that the 8th Air Force grounded deep penetration daylight raids for the next 5 months. The official post-mission analysis cited German fighter coordination, flak concentration, and escort fighter limitations. It said nothing about the flame dampeners. The device meant to hide the bombers had illuminated them like lanterns. And somewhere inside the wreckage of that failure was the beginning of something that would reshape American air power entirely. The problem had a name before anyone understood what the problem was. Army Air Force's engineers called it exhaust flame visibility, and they had been trying to solve it since the first B-17 crews began flying night missions over occupied Europe in the autumn of 1942. The solution they reached for was logical, well-intentioned, and catastrophically wrong. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine, which powered the B-17, produced exhaust gases at temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, unburned fuel particles in the exhaust stream continued combusting after leaving the stack, producing a visible blue-white flame that could extend 18 inches behind each exhaust port. A B-17 had 9 cylinders per engine and 4 engines. At cruise power settings above 20,000 feet, a single aircraft was trailing 36 individual flame sources simultaneously. Formation flying compressed those sources into concentrated rivers of light. A combat box of 54 aircraft, the standard tactical grouping, produced more than 1,900 individual exhaust flames burning continuously against the darkness. German night fighter pilots had noticed this before American planners did. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Jahnen of NJG-1 recorded in his mission logs as early as March 1943 that American heavy bombers on night operations could be identified and tracked by their exhaust signature from distances that rendered radar almost unnecessary. His observation was passed up the Luftwaffe chain of command, incorporated into night fighter training doctrine, and quietly filed away. The Americans remained unaware that their engines were advertising their position. The engineers at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, who developed the dampener system, were solving a real problem with genuine competence. The device they designed worked by routing exhaust gases through a series of baffled chambers that cooled and dispersed the flow before it exited the stack. In laboratory testing at Dayton, the dampeners reduced visible exhaust flame by 68%. The tests were conducted at sea level on stationary engines running at controlled power settings. The test results were real. The test conditions were nothing like combat. At altitude, above 20,000 feet, where outside air temperatures dropped below -50 degrees Celsius, the thermodynamic relationship between exhaust gas and ambient air changed entirely. The baffled chambers that dispersed hot exhaust at sea level became heat exchangers at altitude, cooling the exhaust gases to a precise temperature range where chemiluminescent reactions in the partially combusted fuel mixture intensified rather than diminished. The dampened exhaust, instead of producing a sharp localized flame, produced a diffuse blue glow that spread across the entire rear surface of each engine nacelle. The modification had replaced a bright point source with a broad luminescent panel. Nobody caught the error because nobody tested the dampeners at operational altitude under operational power settings before approving them for fleet installation. The approval process had moved quickly because the need was urgent and the laboratory results were convincing. 712 B-17s and B-24s received the modification between July and September of 1943. Every one of them was now easier to find in the dark than before. The man who finally understood what was happening was not a pilot. He was not a combat officer. He was a 31-year-old physicist from the University of Chicago named Dr. Harold Krim, and he had never been inside a bomber in his life. Krim had been assigned to the Army Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board in the summer of 1943. His job was to look at problems that combat crews reported and find explanations that operational commanders had missed. He was small, wore thick glasses, and got airsick easily. The pilots who briefed him were polite but did not hide their skepticism. A man who turned green in a training aircraft was not their idea of someone who could explain why their friends were dying. But Krim had something the pilots did not. He understood light. His work before the war had focused on how different materials emit and absorb radiation at different temperatures. He had spent years studying the way gases glow when they burn. When the first reports of increased bomber losses following the dampener installation crossed his desk in October 1943, he did not see a mystery. He saw a familiar equation with a terrible answer. He requested three things: a set of the original dampener test reports from Wright Field, a list of the altitude and temperature conditions during the missions that had suffered the highest losses, and one night flight in a modified B-17 over the English countryside with a trained observer in a chase plane flying 2 miles behind. The night flight took place on November 4, 1943, over the flat farmland of Cambridgeshire. The chase plane was a de Havilland Mosquito flown by a Royal Air Force pilot named Squadron Leader Peter Holt, who had been briefed only that he was looking for something and should report honestly what he saw. The B-17 climbed to 22,000 feet and leveled off at cruise power. Holt flew 2 miles behind and slightly below. He called over the radio after 40 seconds. He said the bomber looked like it was on fire. Krim had his answer. He wrote his findings in a 12-page report submitted to the 8th Air Force Technical Staff on November 9, 1943. The language was careful and precise. He explained the thermodynamic mechanism in detail. He included diagrams showing how the baffled chambers produced the luminescent effect at altitude. He noted that the dampeners were performing exactly as designed, and that the design was the problem. He recommended immediate removal of all dampener units pending development of a replacement system tested under actual operational conditions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The report sat on a desk for 6 weeks. The officer responsible for reviewing it had approved the original dampener program. Acknowledging Krim's findings meant acknowledging that 700 aircraft had been made more dangerous to their own crews by a modification he had authorized. The review process moved slowly. Missions continued. Crews climbed into glowing aircraft and flew east into Germany. Gemmell flew 3 more missions before the dampeners were removed from Lucky Penny. The dampeners came off in January 1944. The process was quiet, undramatic, and officially described in Army Air Force's maintenance records as a scheduled equipment review. No press release accompanied the decision. No commander stood before his crews and explained what had happened. The modified exhaust stacks were removed from 712 aircraft by ground crews working through frozen English nights, their breath clouding in the lamplight of dispersal areas across East Anglia. The men doing the work were not told why. The men who had flown with the dampeners installed were not told either. Ray Gemmell learned the truth 20 years later, reading a declassified technical report in a university library in Pittsburgh. Harold Crimm's findings did not disappear with the dampeners. His 12-page report, delayed and quietly filed away during those 6 weeks of institutional paralysis, had been read by enough junior officers that its core insight survived the bureaucratic resistance surrounding it. The lesson it contained was too important and too costly to ignore entirely. The Army Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board used Crimm's methodology, testing modifications under actual operational conditions before fleet installation, as the foundation for a revised equipment approval process that took effect in March 1944. Every piece of airborne equipment approved for installation on 8th Air Force aircraft after that date was tested at altitude, under combat power settings, in the thermal and atmospheric conditions crews actually experienced. The change was procedural and unglamorous. It produced no headlines. But the aircraft that flew into Germany in the final year of the war were equipped with modifications that had been validated in the conditions where they would be used, not in the controlled comfort of a ground-level laboratory. Crimm returned to the University of Chicago after the war and continued his research into thermal radiation and luminescence. He published widely, trained graduate students, and never spoke publicly about his wartime work until a 1971 interview with an aviation history journal, in which he described the dampener episode with the same careful precision he had used in his original report. He said he did not blame the engineers who designed the system. They had solved the problem they were given with the information they had. The problem, he said, was that nobody asked whether the information was sufficient. August Geiger, the Luftwaffe pilot who had first reported the glowing American formations over Schweinfurt, was killed in combat in December 1943, 6 weeks after Crimm submitted his findings and 5 weeks before the dampeners were removed. He did not live to see the formations go dark. The B-17 named Lucky Penny completed 31 missions and was retired from combat service in the summer of 1944. Ray Gemmell came home to Pennsylvania, married, and worked for 30 years as a machinist. He kept a photograph of the aircraft on his workshop wall. He never spoke about Schweinfurt to his children. Some things, he told his wife once, were too heavy to carry into ordinary life. The bombers that followed flew darker. The men inside them never knew why. The war ended. The institutional memory of what had happened did not. Inside the Army Air Forces and later inside the United States Air Force that replaced it in 1947, the dampener episode lived on in the form of the procedures it had produced. The revised equipment approval process that Harold Crimm's report had made possible became standard doctrine. It was codified, expanded, and eventually absorbed into the military acquisition framework that governed how American armed forces evaluated and fielded new technology for the remainder of the 20th century. The language of those regulations did not mention flame dampeners. It did not mention Schweinfurt. It did not mention the 712 aircraft that had flown glowing through German airspace while a report sat on a desk. But the principle at the center of every paragraph was Crimm's principle. Test what you build in the conditions where it will be used. That principle saved lives in Korea. It saved lives in Vietnam. It saves lives today in ways that are invisible precisely because the failures it prevents never happen. The broader story of American strategic bombing over Europe has been told many times, in memoirs and official histories and documentary films. The Schweinfurt raids appear in most of them, cited as evidence of the brutal cost of unescorted daylight precision bombing, of the courage of the crews who flew anyway, of the eventual solution that came with long-range escort fighters in early 1944. The dampener episode appears in almost none of them. It exists in technical appendices and declassified maintenance records and a single journal interview with a physicist who chose his words carefully and never raised his voice. History tends to remember the dramatic failures and the dramatic solutions. The quiet failures, the ones that lived inside maintenance logs and equipment approval forms, have a different kind of importance. They are the failures that institutions learn from, slowly and imperfectly, when the people inside them are honest enough to write down what went wrong. Krim was honest enough. The officer who delayed his report was not dishonest. Exactly. He was a man protecting a decision he had made in good faith with incomplete information, in the compressed and unforgiving timeline of a war that needed answers faster than careful testing could provide them. Both things were true simultaneously. The dampeners were approved in good faith. The delay was an act of self-protection. The crews flew in darkness they did not know they were carrying. Somewhere in the flat farmland outside Cambridge, the airfield at Molesworth has returned to agricultural land. The hard stands where B-17s once sat in the pre-dawn dark, engines turning, exhaust stacks glowing blue-white against the English night, are gone under decades of grass and soil. The men who walked across those hard stands and climbed into those aircraft are nearly all gone too. What remains is the lesson they paid for. Test the thing in the dark before you send men into it. The darkness, it turns out, changes everything. There is a particular kind of institutional courage that never gets monuments built in its honor. It does not involve charging a position under fire or holding a line against impossible odds. It involves writing a report that makes a powerful man uncomfortable and submitting it anyway. It involves reading that report, accepting what it says, and changing the system that produced the error rather than burying the evidence beneath layers of procedural language and organizational pride. Harold Krim practiced that courage in November 1943. The officer who eventually acted on his findings, a brigadier general named Howard Turner who inherited the review process in December after the original responsible officer was reassigned, practiced it too. Turner read the 12 pages in a single sitting, requested the maintenance records for the aircraft that had suffered the highest losses on the missions following dampener installation, compared the numbers against Krim's thermodynamic analysis, and signed the removal order the same afternoon. He did not convene a committee. He did not request a second opinion. He did not wait to see whether the problem might resolve itself through some mechanism he had not yet considered. He understood what the numbers said and he acted on them. Turner died in 1979. His obituary in the Washington Post mentioned his post-war career in defense procurement, his work modernizing Air Force logistics systems, and his retirement at the rank of lieutenant general. It did not mention the dampener removal order. The decision that may have saved more lives than any single operational choice he made in 3 decades of service was too quiet, too technical, and too embedded in maintenance records to find its way into a newspaper obituary. That invisibility is not accidental. The entire value of a good institutional process is that it produces unremarkable outcomes. Aircraft that do not glow. Modifications that do not kill the men they were designed to protect. Equipment that performs in combat the way it performed in testing because the testing was honest about what combat actually was. These are not stories. They are the absence of stories. The missions that flew and returned, the crews that climbed down from their aircraft in the cold East Anglian mornings and walked to breakfast without understanding precisely why they were still alive, are not recorded anywhere in the way that losses are recorded. The dampener episode endures not because it was the largest failure of the air war over Europe. It was not. It endures because it contains, compressed into 12 pages and 6 weeks of delay and 1-night flight over Cambridgeshire, everything essential about how institutions fail and how they recover. The gap between knowing something and acting on it. The cost of that gap measured in men and aircraft. The unglamorous procedural work of closing it permanently. Ray Gemmel's photograph of Lucky Penny hung on his workshop wall until he died in 1987. His daughter found it when she was clearing the house. She did not know what it meant. She kept it anyway because he had. Some things outlast the understanding of them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.